Hello and welcome to the Mind Tools Expert Voices podcast. And get ready to meet 6 of the most difficult people you'll ever encounter. But don't worry, we'll also hear how to handle them. I'm Rachel Salaman, host of all the expert interviews in the Mind Tools archive.
And I'm Jonathan Hancock, a senior writer at Mind Tools, where we make resources to help you deal with every conceivable workplace challenge, including all the different, difficult personalities you're likely to come up against. And once again, Rachel and I will be focusing on our vast collection of expert conversations in search of insights, ideas, and practical advice.
For more than 25 years, Mind Tools has explored the challenges of working with, managing, and being managed by some difficult characters. And today, we'll both choose clips from the full-length expert interviews as we focus on 6 types of problematic people. I'll be looking at know-it-alls, aggressive people, including passive-aggressive behaviour, and political operators.
And I'll take on pessimists, perfectionists, and disorganised time wasters. So why are they like that? How can we stop them causing us problems? And can we even help them to change?
So let's see if we can stop getting so frustrated and start seeing the way forward. This is Mind Tools Expert Voices. What do you do about difficult people? So before we get into some of the types of difficult behaviour and how to handle it, I should say that we're not talking about breaches of codes of conduct or breaking the law or anything like that, right, Jonathan?
Yeah.
So we're not going to touch on, for example, serious bullying, misconduct or discrimination in this podcast. What we're talking about today is those annoying people whose difficult behaviour stops you and your team from feeling great and doing your best work.
Yeah, and I guess it can often feel like you can't do very much about it because they don't come under any particular rules, or you don't think there's a system for solving it. But maybe we do have a few answers for dealing with those annoying, frustrating, just difficult people that you meet.
Yes, because almost everyone works with difficult people at some time or another.
Yeah, we won't mention any names today, but yes, I'm sure we've all got people in mind as we're talking about these people today.
Yes, absolutely. And I've spoken to a few experts in the Mind Tools expert interviews about what to do about it. One of these is Dr. Rick Brinkman. Now, he's the author of the best-selling book, Dealing with People You Can't Stand. So before we get into the 6 annoying co-workers we're focusing on today, let's hear a clip of my interview with Rick, where he talks about dealing with difficult people in general.
We all have people that we can't stand, and technically speaking, it's not the person as much as a certain behavior that they engage in. You know, like somebody could be whining, or you could have a coworker who's always being negative, or a boss who's being a know-it-all, and you can't seem to suggest an idea to them. And it may appear to us that they're always like that, but that's really because we only know them in a limited context and a limited relationship. Context being where are we, what's going on, a relationship, of course, what's our relationship to that person. Let's say our know-it-all boss, we don't realize how passive they can be in a different context, maybe with their spouse or such.
So that sounds like a lot of these situations could be turned around through a change in behaviour, a change in attitude, or better communication.
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is like a phone number. You need all the digits to get through, and you need them in the right order. If you dial your country code at the end as an afterthought, the call does not get through properly. Communication is equally specific. So, for example, staying with your know-it-all boss for a moment, there is a number, a strategy that you can do that's going to get them out of being a know-it-all and open their mind. And then there's things that you'll do that'll push them deeper into that. And so it's important to know what to do with each behavior.
That's a really vivid metaphor, isn't it? Communication is a telephone number.
Yes, if one digit's wrong, you've got communication breakdown, haven't you? And one difficulty in someone's behaviour can be enough to cause that. But on the positive side, you might only need to fix one bit. Just get one more number right and you get through.
And we're going to try and find the right numbers to get through
Good.
to a number of people with difficult behaviour, starting with that know-it-all that Rick mentioned. Could be a boss, could be a co-worker. They're the ones who are always right, according to them. They fancy themselves as experts on anything and everything. And they often find it hard to listen to other people. So we could tell them to shut up, But some experts, Jonathan, advise us to do the opposite because these people might not be as self-confident as they appear. One of those experts is Dr. Melanie Katzman, author of the best-selling book Connect First.
Oftentimes, the people who are strutting their stuff, the peacock who seems to be telling everybody about their latest accomplishments, is really the person who is insecure, is needing more reassurance. And it's exactly what we don't want to do. So the person who seems to be boasting isn't the one who you want to say, great job. But in fact, most egos could use a little stroking, and the ones that are so desperately asking for your attention need it even more. Knee-jerk reaction is to avoid or deny praise or appreciation for the people who seem so desperately in need. So I encourage people to stroke another individual's narcissism. We're all a little bit narcissistic.
So praise a peacock know-it-all, or at least listen to them for a bit. That disarms them because it gives them what they crave.
Well, I wonder if this is going to turn out to be a theme today, this idea of spotting a need in somebody, like thinking, well, why are they like that? What do they need? And giving them a bit of what they need. I guess then the question is going to be, like, how much do you give them? At what point are you just pandering to them?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you just need to be a bit kind to the person, slightly different from giving them what they might crave. Even when you're dealing with mean and aggressive people, that's the second archetype that we're going to look at today after the know-it-all. So these mean, aggressive people, these are the co-workers or bosses who vent loudly and openly, and they're just rude to people around them. And I think that the natural impulse is usually just to avoid people like that. I know that's how I feel. Get out of the firing line. But we could try empathizing with them instead. Here's Dr. Jay Winner, author of a book called Take the Stress Out of Your Life.
One of the more common things we have in business, for instance, is dealing with rude people. And I do an exercise in all my class. It's been done with thousands of people. And I ask people, raise your hand if you've ever been rude in your life. And, of course, everybody raises their hand. The next question is, raise your hand if when you're rude, it's usually when you're happiest and feeling your best. At that point, nobody raised their hand. And what we can extrapolate from that is when people are rude, usually they're suffering in one way or another. And that's a good reframe for us. That's a good way of thinking about it. When somebody starts acting rude, instead of how dare they treat me like that, we can say, I wonder what's wrong with that person. It can bring forth a little empathy and then thereby decreasing our stress and anxiety and anger.
Sounds like a great approach on paper, but I wonder how many people really could be so saintly. What do you think?
Yes, exactly what I was thinking. It makes very good logical sense. But for me, I think the moment I feel myself giving something to someone because they've been aggressive, that feels like I'm losing, possibly, or giving in to them. Although I have experienced it working, I have to say, when I've kind of overcome my instincts and thought, all right, I'll let this person get their way or maybe give them what they need. And it actually has worked quite well. I've been glad I did it that way.
Yes, I think there must be something in it because Jay Winner wasn't actually the only expert interview guest to suggest this approach. Robin Koval is another. She's the co-author of a book called The Power of Nice, How to Conquer the Business World with Kindness. And this was the book, Jonathan, that introduced me to the concept of starring in the movie of your own life. Have you heard about that?
Yes, you've mentioned that before. Just remind me, is that because you have more control than you realise?
Actually, it's almost the opposite. It's to remind ourselves that we see the world only from our own point of view.
Okay.
And sometimes we need to get out of that, get out of our own movie and try and co-star in someone else's.
Right.
And this is what Robin says when it comes to dealing with a mean person.
A million things could put somebody in a bad mood where they would make a remark that would seem mean and aggressive. So don't always assume it's about you. We like to say put your head on the other person's shoulders because chances are they weren't really trying to be mean. And even if they are, a little nasty, what's going on there? I read a story the other day. A woman wrote me a letter who had read the book, and she said, I had this mean coworker. She's always nasty, always has something unkind to say. And, rather than doing a tit for tat and saying something nasty back, I finally decided I was just going to bring her chocolates. And she brought her in chocolates, and she said the woman was so overwhelmed and said, oh, my God, that's the kindest thing anybody's ever done for me at work, and now, only has nice things to say about her. So, it's get out of your own movie, co-star in somebody else's movie, make them the star, say something nice about them, compliment their earrings, watch, and you'll see the reaction you get. You can turn a lot of mean people into at least temporarily nice ones.
Do you know what? I might flip that around, though, because I do get what Robin's saying. I think it's hard, but worth trying. You'd have to practice it a bit, but I think it's basically a good thing to do, to try and see it from other people's point of view. But I would also say, if you're the sort of person, if you are that difficult person, and deep down, sometimes you come in a bad mood and you spray out a bit of unkindness or thoughtlessness around you, well, people are going to take that personally. And I think it's worth thinking about it from that point of view too. We can't sort of get away from that instinctive feeling if somebody's been grumpy or even mean, that it feels like it's about us.
Yes, and that idea of bringing someone who's in a bad mood chocolates is just a really sweet idea. I don't know whether it would work in every case, but
I might try it once and see what the impact was. You never know, with one particular person, it might just break the ice, it might soften things, and suddenly everything might get better.
Especially if it's a mood-based thing. Yeah. And of course, there are other situations where it's not about mood. It's about a long-term chronic annoyance that's going on with someone that could be triggered by a system or a process or the way someone else is working. And it's those situations that perhaps you need to address more formally. I talked to the psychiatrist and negotiator Mark Goulston twice for our Mind Tools Expert interview series about his books Just Listen and Real Influence. And he told me a tried and tested process for stepping an aggressive person back into a constructive frame of mind.
When someone is venting at you or saying something that normally would get you very upset, you want to use the I word, and the I word is important. Meaning many people who act up in this way do so because, rightly or wrongly, they feel that the world is treating them as unimportant. So let them say whatever they've said, and you don't want to trigger them by saying, "Are you through?" because that will just anger them. Instead, say, when they pause, say, "Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?" Just being that respectful will start to slightly calm them down. After that, what you want to say is, it's really important that I heard exactly what you said, so let me run it by you to make sure that I heard it correctly. When you then play back to someone what they've said at you, it slows them down because you're forcing them to listen instead of venting. And the reason they will listen is because you said that what they told you was so important. Ask them at the end of that, is that correct? And then if they add something to it, then repeat that back to them. And what you're wanting to get is for them to sign off and say, yes, you got it. So they're saying yes also sets them up to being more cooperative.
I mentioned that Mark's a psychiatrist and he's really interested in how the brain works. He mentions a bit of the neurology now in the next part of the process.
And so what you've done is you've gone from their lower brain, which was the fight or flight reptile brain. You slowed them down with the first set of questions by repeating what they said. And now you've calmed them down emotionally, which is our middle brain, our mammalian brain, by having them attach a word to their feelings. And now what you want to do is switch them up to their rational brain so you can have a constructive conversation. So that the next place you switch it to is, and the reason it's so important that we solve this now is, and they'll give you a reason. Well, because if we don't get this solved, then we're going to miss some deadlines, and we're going to make some clients really angry, and then we're going to have another crisis here. And then you can finally go into, and so let's talk about how we might solve it.
So it means you have to stay calm, which isn't always easy when someone else is getting out of control. And I can remember back when I first got into management years ago, there was someone who was just instinctively angry, it seemed, and they were often quite aggressive with me. And to start with, I just tried to match their level of energy and come back at them quite forcefully sometimes. And it did not work. It just made things worse. I think there may be times when mirroring someone helps, but that wasn't one of those times. But actually things got a lot better when I went the other way and pulled back, and I was the one who was calm, and I listened. And I remember quite actively helping them to clarify what their problem was. And that was the way to talk them down to a more reasonable position. And usually we could work out what the problem was and what we should do about it.
Yeah, difficult to do, but really worth a try. So those are some ways to handle aggressive people at work. What about passive aggressive people? Now, it's not easy to define passive aggressiveness, is it? What do you understand by that?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I think it's when you know instinctively that someone's being aggressive, but their behaviour or their words on the surface aren't aggressive.
Yeah.
So there's something confusing, maybe even a bit duplicitous going on. But because it is so hard to call out or to define even, I think that's what makes it a really difficult type of behaviour to deal with.
Yeah, it's a basic unstraightforwardness, isn't it? And it's worth mentioning that we've got a really good Book Insights book review audio in the Mind Tools Club on a book called 8 Keys to Eliminating Passive Aggressiveness by Andrea Brandt. And that book takes passive aggressive to mean people who manage to behave disruptively without obviously meaning to.
Yeah.
So these people don't say what they mean, and they often don't do what they say they're going to do. And I want to bring in Amy Gallo here. She's the author of a book called Getting Along: How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. And she's our latest guest on the Expert Interview series in the Mind Tools Club. And when I asked her about passive-aggressive behaviour, she brought up psychological safety, which we did a whole Expert Voices episode about, didn't we? It was episode 2, I think.
Yes.
Here's Amy making the connection between psychological safety and passive-aggressive behaviour.
You know, I think about what I think of as the 3 pillars of psychological safety, which are care, we have one another's back; consistency, we behave in a reliable and predictable manner; and then the last one is candor, right? We say what we mean, and we mean what we say. And if you think about passive aggressive behavior, it really undermines candor specifically, right? Because people aren't saying exactly what they think and feel. They, for some reason, don't feel able to be direct and honest. And they're violating consistency because they might say one thing in a meeting and then do something different. So it can be really corrosive to a team to have someone who's exhibiting that behavior and getting away with it.
So really tricky behaviour. What to do about it? Well, Amy suggests that a good starting point is talking to that person about their behaviour, because they might not even realise that they're being passive aggressive. Or, perhaps more importantly to them, that might be damaging their careers.
Very rarely, I think people go home and say, oh, I was so passive aggressive at work today, right? They don't have that self-awareness. They might think, well, I didn't feel comfortable being honest, so I was a little petty. I probably wasn't very kind in that meeting, but they don't think of themselves as passive aggressive. So helping someone understand how their behavior is being interpreted by others and how that might be preventing them from reaching their goals.
And I think this is good advice for another difficult person archetype as well, the political operator or manipulator. So these are people who will do whatever they have to do to get ahead, and they sometimes hog the limelight, or they take the credit for a team effort, for example, or they trample on other people as they try and climb the ranks. And during my chat with Amy Gallo, we talked about dealing with all kinds of difficult behaviour in a remote work environment. And she used the example of a political operator.
If your, political operator colleague on a Zoom call, keeps saying, I did this, when it was actually the whole team, you might let it go, or you might set up a call afterwards to just say, I noticed you kept saying I when the whole team was involved in that project. Why did you do that? Or make a direct request. Next time you present, I'd like to make sure I'm spotlighted too in the Zoom call, and that we're making sure everyone gets credit where credit is due.
She's talking about remote working there, as I said, but that approach could work in an office environment too, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think it could. I think, again, it's trying to clarify things with people. It's letting people know the impact they're having, which sometimes takes quite a bit of bravery in my experience.
Yeah.
Also, it made me think, how has the virtual working world and hybrid working, how has that changed some of our relationships with difficult people? Does it mean that we let things go a bit more in some cases because we can just switch our computer off and we can vent a bit in our own homes or whatever and leave them for a while? We don't have to sit next to them or even see them again that day. Or does it also sometimes make it worse because we only have that moment with them. And it's really, like Amy was saying there, it's on the screen and it's kind of condensed in front of you. So sometimes maybe it makes these things even worse.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. I suppose either way, for a manager, it's often hard to call out the behaviour of a political operator because they've worked so hard to get in the good books of all the right people. They might have some powerful allies because that's almost a definition of a political operator. So you might have to be a bit political when you're dealing with political operators so you don't harm your own career. Something to think about. Well, I spoke to the Harvard professor Joseph L. Badaracco, the author of several books, including Managing in the Grey. And he told me about a young manager who had a slacker on her team who was an arch political operator. And she was worried that if she just fired him, it would come back to bite her because this person was so well connected. So she called him into her office and she told him that he'd been underperforming.
And she said, I'm not going to fire you, but I'm going to give you some time to really look around for another job inside or outside the organization. And I'm not going to tell you how much time that's going to take, and I'm not to talk to anybody else about this. I want you and me to just see if we can find a way to resolve this. The luck was that this guy understood that he really didn't belong. He spent a couple months looking, and he actually did find something better. But she didn't take on her bosses, and she didn't take him on directly, and she didn't fire him. She had some luck, and I recommend luck to everybody listening to this. But there was a lot of astute political maneuvering to avoid big problems for her.
Managing in the grey, indeed. Sometimes difficult behaviour means managers do have to think creatively to keep the whole team and themselves on track.
Yeah, it's making me wonder actually if that's quite close to passive aggression though. If you're very nicely suggesting that it might be in someone's best interest to go and have a look for a job somewhere else. In some ways, that is sort of passive aggressive. Although I can see in that particular case, it was probably a very astute thing to do. And I guess that's the secret, isn't it? Understanding the situation and that particular person's needs, but keeping ourselves in control so that we can spot the clever move that will work with that person, which may mean taking a step back and getting them to do some of the work rather than us always having to suffer and be the ones trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, definitely a two-way street. Well, I'll finish off my half with some more wisdom from Rick Brinkman, author of Dealing with People You Can't Stand, who we heard from at the beginning. Now, he talks about something called blending, which is meeting people where they are and reducing differences. So this means you might, for example, crouch down to talk to a child at eye level, or you might dress in a similar way to friends that you're going out with. Rick says you can use blending to deal with difficult people in the workplace. In this clip, he talks about someone who hassles people, who he calls the get-it-done boss, and someone who slows things down, who he calls the get-along co-worker, who sounds a bit passive-aggressive too.
So let's say we have a get-it-done boss who is running over people. By speeding things up, by being bottom line and to the point, that blends with them. If, on the other hand, going to the other extreme, we have a get-along coworker who's being very agreeable, but we don't really know where they stand, then slowing down, being easygoing and friendly. Again, let's say we need something by Thursday. We wouldn't want to be direct about it. We'd want to let them know, listen, I want you to know that I know you got a lot of stuff going on right now, and if you don't think you can get this done by Thursday, that's okay. They'll go, oh, no, it's okay. And no, really, I want you to actually don't even tell me now. I want you to check your schedule. This is going to also require something from the other department. Check with them. It's not a problem. So you got to slow down, go easygoing, and that meets them where they are in the get-along mode. And by blending with people, that allows you to then lead them or redirect them to something else.
General advice for dealing with difficult people from Dr. Rick Brinkman: meet them where they are. So we heard how to praise know-it-alls earlier, how to disarm aggressive and mean people with empathy, and if there's something lasting and specific bothering someone, we got a clear 4-step process for stepping aggressive people back. We heard from our latest expert interview guest, Amy Gallo, that we can try the direct approach with passive-aggressive people and political operators. And we had a reminder from Professor Joe Badaracco that we might have to think about complex solutions if we need to deal with a particularly tricky political situation. So what do you think about that advice? Have you had to deal with any particularly difficult situations at work, difficult people? We'd love to hear from you.
And it's easy to get involved. Just email us at expertvoicespodcast@mindtools.com or find Rachel or me on LinkedIn.
And remember that Mind Tools is home to thousands of articles, videos, quizzes, workbooks and more, including all the expert interviews that we're dipping into today. Explore every aspect of business skills, leadership and management, and personal development, including those all-important interpersonal skills that you'll need to deal with difficult people.
Yes, and why not start with our quiz? How good are your people skills? You can find that at mindtools.com, or maybe do a quick search for part of your performance that you know you need to work on. Sample everything we've got to offer and find out more about subscribing for yourself or your team at mindtools.com. Okay, so it's my turn now as we continue this roll call of the most annoying, frustrating, and downright difficult people at work. And first, I'd like to add into the mix the moper, the whiner, the eternal pessimist. Well, give them their dues. A couple of the expert interview guests did point out that negative people like this can sometimes be useful if they're highlighting problems, for example, or keeping their team thinking realistically. But many more experts talk about how pessimists sap others of energy, slow down projects, and generally spoil the mood of everyone around them. Here's Jackie Beretta, founding partner of the consulting firm Neurogroup and the author of Primal Teams, Harnessing the Power of Emotions to Fuel Extraordinary Performance. And this is Jackie's take on the damaging impact of negative emotions, what she calls emotional contagion.
3 strangers can come and sit in a room, and they can sit in total silence, not even looking at each other. And within a minute or two, the most emotionally active person will have transmitted his or her mood to the other 2. And they say that any group of people will essentially end up sharing the same mood if they're together for a while. So we think about our teams. We're together all the time. We have meetings and, we sit together or whatever. We're passing around our mood. So emotional contagion is happening all over.
So that's pretty good advice for all 6 of these difficult people when we're dealing with any kind of annoyance or frustration at work, I guess. Understanding our own behaviour too, the power it can have. But I think especially pessimism, I notice how quickly that can spread amongst people. Have you suffered emotional contagion by pessimists?
Well, maybe I'm a bit unusual here, but I think when I'm in the presence of a pessimist, it just brings out the optimism in me. And I just want to, put them straight, make them see the bright side.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just me.
No, I think that's a very good point. And maybe it's just me getting dragged down by all of these pessimists. But I will have a go at it your way, I promise. I'll try to meet them with extra positivity and see what happens. In fact, maybe it's something that we should try with all 6 of these difficult people we're dealing with today. But I tell you what, I notice the impact of pessimism very much in breakout rooms in virtual meetings. Do you ever do those when you're using things like Teams and Zoom for a big group session and you end up in one of these breakout areas, sometimes with people you don't know very well or even at all? I found that a pessimistic person in one of these virtual rooms can very quickly infect everyone with their mood. And all of a sudden, the energy's gone and there is no chance we're going to find a way of achieving whatever the facilitator sent us off to do.
And that reminds me of a tip that Amy Gallo had. We heard her in the first half. She suggests that if you have one of these pessimists in your team, go with it. Make them the pessimist in chief. So for every project, charge them with pointing out all the things that could go wrong. And then all the negativity is ring-fenced there. And it also might be quite useful because they might point out some things that you hadn't thought of before.
It's a bit like Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats idea, isn't it? And if you've not heard about that, you can read about it on the Mind Tool site. But it's a way of getting people to do specific types of thinking when you're collaborating. So it could be a good approach to getting people out of their pessimism. You could say, right, yesterday you pointed out all the difficulties. Today, you're going to wear a positive hat or the free thinking hat and see what a difference that makes.
Yeah, depending on whether you want to play to people's strengths or
yeah.
not. If you can see pessimism as a strength.
Definitely. And I think it'll be intriguing to see if there are some other positives that come out from these seemingly negative behaviours. We've certainly spotted a few ways already that we might be able to use elements of people's difficult characters for the better. But I do think there needs to be that element of control, that sort of ring fencing around it, especially if you're a manager or a team leader. Well, other tips from the experts. Some talk to you, Rachel, about bringing more playfulness out at work, or maybe firing back at pessimists with extra amounts of positivity. But I guess we're still bound to meet proper pessimists at work from time to time, and it's just the way they are, the way they've been built. So here's some practical advice in that case from Dana Barocca in California. Dana is the author of Cracking the Personality Code. And you'll hear now his do's and don'ts when you're dealing with a pessimist.
Don't agree with them. That just encourages them to continue to complain. Don't disagree with them, as they'll feel the need to repeat their woes. Don't try to solve their problems because you can't. Do have patience with their unrealistic standards and their endless negativity, let's say. Do have compassion for them, as their lives just seem to be beyond their control, and do have commitment to the process for getting them to be focused on a solution. So one way to do that is listen and write down the main points of their complaints. Let's say you're a manager. Let's write it down. So it helps to take responsibility for it, or even you can even have them write it down. But usually the manager writes down. So what I hear you saying is da 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 da. No, I didn't mean that. Well, what do you mean then? Let's get specific here. Well, I don't think this will ever get solved. Well, let's pretend that we were going to solve it, and have them just explain more of what they would like to get out of this unrealistic thing that they think, and base everything on the facts and information, and get them to be back on that alone, and keep repeating it over and over again.
At what point should you think about removing them from your team, any of these difficult personalities?
If it becomes chronic, it's just a constant issue and it's draining away from the team. I think in our environment that's going to continue globally, none of us can afford to have people continue to do that. There has to be solutions. There has to be contribution. There has to be a talent and a willingness to solve problems.
And Rachel, I really like the fact that you asked him that question there towards the end about whether there's a line after which the person might not be the right fit for the team or for the organisation. But you've got to do work before that. You've got to listen carefully to them, give them space, check that they've understood, reframe things, do all of those things, give them the opportunity to change and do your bit as a manager. But still, there might be that point where you have to make a tough decision about their future in the team.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, closely allied to pessimism is perfectionism. And the perfectionist is the fifth of our 6 difficult people today. You know the type. Small details are huge problems. Nothing's ever going to be good enough. But just like we said that pessimism can have some benefits, I think it's even easier to see that perfectionism also has a plus side. That's what Tal Ben-Shahar calls adaptive perfectionism. Tal's from Harvard University. And he spoke to you, Rachel, about his book, The Pursuit of Perfect. But Tal said the flip side of adaptive perfectionism is the maladaptive side, which he says can cause some serious problems.
Adaptive perfectionism is striving for higher and higher standards. It's working hard. It's making sure things are done and done well. So that's healthy in most situations. The maladaptive perfectionism, the unhealthy perfectionism, is about the rejection of success, of failure, and painful emotions. So it is a fear of failure that is debilitating, a fear of failure that doesn't allow us to try, to take risks, to explore, to meander. We constantly have this voice inside us telling us, you're not enough. We have this voice telling us that you have just failed or you are a failure. And when we hear this voice over and over again, then that has consequences when our self-esteem and happiness are concerned.
So I think it's worth remembering that perfectionists, however annoying and frustrating, are probably suffering quite a bit themselves. And if we can boost their self-esteem and make problems less about them personally, then we might be able to help a bit and maybe change some of that difficult maladaptive perfectionism. And Tal Ben-Shahar promotes this concept of optimalism, which I really like. And this is much more about realism, about accepting that mistakes are inevitable and are actually good, like we were saying on our previous podcast, the benefits of learning from mistakes. I think maladaptive perfectionists miss out on that point sometimes. He said a good way to nudge perfectionists towards this more positive side is to spend more time reflecting on success.
So, for example, to look at a project that was well run in the organization and ask oneself, why was it well run? What have I learned from past failures that led to this success? And time and again, what these managers will see is that failure was an inevitable part of it. Another very useful technique is to read biographies of successful people. Honest biographies don't just give the 5 steps to thriving. They don't just talk about the 3 secrets of success. They show what was actually done along the way, which means where the failures came, where the difficulties came, and they show the entire picture. And when one sees the entire picture, one learns to appreciate it a lot more and hence apply it in one's life.
I think that is a very good practical way of countering that negative tendency, which I certainly recognise in myself at times. And I think actually many of us are on a sort of spectrum between maladaptive and adaptive perfectionism. So I think it does make sense to use evidence of success to nudge people to be that bit more positive and more realistic, and I suppose more resilient to mistakes.
Yes, and I really like Tal's idea of reading biographies of successful people and realising all the failures that went into those successes. And I wonder if managers who might have a perfectionist on their team, and if that perfectionism is getting in the way, if the manager might just give them a copy of a biography that they think might help them.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Have a stock of those ready to hand out to people.
Yeah.
Good point. I've got one more character type that we might come up against. So we've gone through 5 so far. This is difficult person number 6 today, the person who's so disorganised and unreliable that that's what causes havoc with teamwork and frustrates everyone they meet and, crucially, wastes precious time. If you can influence them, say as a manager or a close colleague, or maybe you could help them focus a bit more, focus on the important things rather than trying and failing to do everything. That's what Canadian Chris Bailey talked to you about, Rachel, in your expert interview. Do you remember he spent a year trying out all sorts of productivity techniques?
Yeah.
And he wrote a book about that experience called The Productivity Project. He told you how important he's worked out that it is, he's experienced it is, to get people focusing on what they really need to do.
Because if you don't know what you actually need to be productive on, you're not going to become more productive. And so taking that step back to figure out and write down and capture everything in your work and picking the 3 things that are the most valuable is crucial and is one of the most helpful things that you can do. In addition to that, I would say the rule of 3. And the rule of 3 is one of the simplest time management techniques that I know of, but it's also kind of an attention and energy management technique at the same time. And it's so simple. At the start of each day, you fast forward to the end of the day and you think, by the time the day is done, what 3 main things will I want to have accomplished? And those become the primary focus that you have throughout the day. And it's so simple, and you do other stuff too, of course, because if you only did 3 things all day long, you probably wouldn't have a job for much longer. But it's important because at the same time that you decide what you focus on throughout the day, when you decide what's important, you also decide what isn't important, because at the same time, you decide what you don't do.
That seemed to me a particularly useful portable technique, if you like. It's something that you could quite quickly hand over to somebody that was causing problems because of their disorganization, and maybe something that you could do yourself to model it to other people as well, and you could quite consciously show them that's how I'm managing to get everything done.
Yeah, it's so easy to remember, isn't it? Rule of 3. Yeah.
And Chris was very keen on the importance of single tasking, not multitasking or switch tasking, which are so often the behaviours of annoyingly disorganized people.
The studies around multitasking are conclusive, and they show that the practice doesn't work. It leads you to waste more time. It prevents you from becoming immersed in your work. You basically do a mediocre job of everything. Single tasking, working on one thing at one time, allows you to channel like a laser all of your attention and all of your energy and time into one thing at a time, so you can do a hell of a job of it. And so that means, disabling the distractions around you and just bringing as much attention to what's in front of you at one time as you can.
So maybe we can help a teammate or a direct report to focus on one important thing at any one time, and that's how we can guide them towards being more organised and more productive and less problematic to us. I loved Eileen Marcus's typically direct approach to dealing with disorganised people. In her interview with you, Rachel, from New York City, she talks about people who waste our time because of their disorganisation. And she dug out some tips from her book, which is perfect for this podcast, Managing Annoying People.
With this player I have who's now annoying, right away I say, we have 15 minutes today to discuss this. How do you want to use that time? So from the beginning, you set the expectation. This is limited. There's a beginning, middle, and end, and we're going to end on time. The other one I love is the sandwich technique, because I love food, but sandwich this person between two other meetings. So we have the team meeting, I meet with them for 15 minutes, and then I have my management meeting or a call or something. And there's a little special tip in that. It really works well if you sandwich between when they have something important to them. It could be something personal, like, Wednesday nights, they always have to go home for family supper, or they take their yoga class, or they have their religious meeting. Or it could be they have their team meeting, at 12 o'clock. So we have our team meeting at 10 o'clock. We finish at 11:30. I meet with them for 15 minutes, and then they go off to their team meeting. So that sandwich technique really works in bookending and setting the timetable.
I found that quite refreshing as a way to retake control in those tricky situations. And actually, I used her first tip there a few years back myself with somebody outside of work who was doing that thing of sucking my time, but they didn't seem to have any idea how little time I ever had to give them, and it was really problematic, really frustrating. But it changed when I basically just started telling them how much time I had. So I would say, look, we've got 15 minutes now, and we could focus and get on and actually do what we needed to do in the 15 minutes. And it was so reassuring to have that boundary and to have said it, and everybody was clear we had to get it done in that time. So I can definitely recommend that idea of ring-fencing the time and being clear with people about how much time you've got. And I've got one more expert that I'd like to take a clip from, Rachel, from the expert interviews, Wayne Termel. Now, he had some great advice for dealing with these disorganised people and time wasters in the specific context of meetings, which almost all of us have to have, of course, these days. Lots of our working life is taken up in meetings, and how frustrating it can be if there's a disorganised, time-wasting person in that meeting with you. Well, Wayne is a very well-known speaker and author, and the man behind books like Meet Like You Mean It. And he told you, Rachel, that whoever's coming to the meeting, you can solve lots of problems just by getting the planning right.
This sounds simplistic, but it's really what is it the meeting is supposed to achieve? And it's astounding how often we don't take time before we call a meeting to clearly define the purpose and the outcome of the meeting. And those are two different things. So what is a good agenda? There's the logistics part, right? When is it? How long is it? How do I join? That good stuff. There's a clearly stated purpose for the meeting. Outcome is the desired outcome. At the end of this meeting, what are we going to have achieved? Then what are the expectations of the participants so that they can be properly prepared? I need you to read this document and be prepared with your questions and your suggestions. And then the final piece is any preparation we can possibly give them in terms of documents, heads up, where we left off in the last meeting, so that when people show up, they know why they're there, they know what they're supposed to achieve, and you can tell whether or not you did it.
That's another technique I've seen work in practice, actually, because I was once working in a school, and over a period of time, you could just tell that meetings had become really disorganised, and there was lots of tension and annoyance in the air. And so we went back to having a really clear agenda and giving people things to read beforehand and allocating roles, and then really clearly sticking to timings during the meeting. That was very important. And I think it was quite a shock to the system for some people, but after a few meetings, I think you can noticeably tell that people were appreciating it and it was working so much better, and we could get through things efficiently in the time, and the right people were getting a chance to speak up, and we could go home at the end having done everything we set out to do. And I think it just became a more creative process as well, and we could even have some fun because there was a boundary and a structure in place.
Yes, I think boundaries are sometimes underrated.
So from the clips I chose from the Mind Tools archive, we heard that pessimistic people can spoil a team's mood, but there are ways to nudge them into a much more positive outlook. Pessimism can slip into perfectionism too, which can slow everyone down and stop projects from getting finished, or it can be redirected into optimalism with realistic standards and where mistakes are okay. And for our final problem type, that disorganized person who wastes everyone's time, we heard tips for controlling how much of our attention they get and for helping them to focus more and start being less frustrating for the good of themselves and us.
But have we dealt with all the types of difficult people at work, do you think? Which challenging characters would you add to our list? And what's your advice for coping with and maybe changing them?
Let Rachel and me know what you think. You can find us on LinkedIn or send us an email at expertvoicespodcast@mindtools.com.
Which is what Brian did from London after listening to our last episode about feedback. He says, when I worked in a call centre, managers used to randomly listen into my calls and then give me feedback on what they heard. This seemed like a bit of a waste of time, he says, because it was only based on one interaction with one customer, which I often didn't remember and may not have been very representative of how I usually worked. This system made me feel like they were just going through the motions, he says, rather than wanting to help me learn and improve. As feedback goes, it wasn't exactly painful, but it wasn't very useful either.
Actually, on similar lines, David Croft got in touch on LinkedIn responding to our conversations about anonymous feedback. And like us and our experts, David is not a fan. Particularly, he says, when an HR system asks me to give anonymous feedback on senior people. He says, well, if it's really anonymous, how is that going to be of any use to anyone? And if they can somehow see it's me giving the feedback, how safe is it for me to give honest feedback about my bosses? So I think David raises some very good questions there. Possibly have a think about that if you run an anonymous feedback system like that, or it could be something to talk to a manager about if you're not entirely sure how safe it is to give anonymous feedback like that at work.
And another angle on feedback from Emma in East Sussex. Thanks, Emma. She says, I have a boss who avoids giving feedback at all costs, but I'd love to get some. So it would be good to know how and when to ask for feedback without giving the wrong impression and coming over as underconfident or insecure.
I will point Emma towards an article that we have on the Mind Tools site, actually, about asking for feedback. And it's funny because that does flip around lots of the themes from the last episode of this podcast. I guess we're kind of assuming that people would find it difficult to get feedback and maybe a bit reluctant to hear it. I think that's a very good point from Emma. You know, we need feedback and often we want feedback, and it isn't always easy to get it from people. So maybe it's about working out how we ask for it, as well as managers being confident to give it, and working together on that collaborative approach that we talked about in the last episode. Definitely worth listening back to that if feedback is an issue for you. And I just wanted to get in one more bit of feedback about feedback from that last episode. It's a positive note from Justine Gale, who got in touch on LinkedIn from Los Angeles. Justine says, it's amazing how well people can do and reveal untapped skills when they're supported in a way that acknowledges what they do well, and then you use that to show how they can do even better overall by improving in another area. And she says feedback needs to be kind and non-judgmental and comes best from people that you know, trust and respect. So very much in keeping with the experts that we heard from in that particular episode of Mind Tools Expert Voices. And Justine laughed at my beach ball experiment. Do you remember that when I was talking about a session where we had to write anonymous things about each other in our group on a beach ball? She said it sounded like something out of a social experiment TV show. Yes, funny, but also quite sinister at the time. Thank you very much for getting in touch, Justine.
And we'll be back soon with another episode of Expert Voices. So why not get your voice heard and join the discussion about feedback, difficult people, or any of the topics we've delved into so far. All of our past episodes are still there for you on the Mind Tools website or wherever you found this podcast.
By email, it's expertvoicespodcast@mindtools.com, or just message us on LinkedIn. And do have a look at everything Mind Tools has to offer. All the details about our wealth of resources, world-leading services, and easy ways to join us are at mindtools.com.
And meanwhile, look out for those 6 particularly difficult people we've met today. Try putting some of our expert advice into practice.
And maybe think about whether you might even slip into one or more of those categories yourself at times, and what you can do about it now.
Yes, and then tell us what happened for next time.
Yes.
See you then.